The sun was just beginning to slip behind the western hills when she stepped onto the porch, her hand resting lightly on the weathered post her husband once leaned against. The air smelled of dry grass and dust, the kind of scent that carried with it both loneliness and promise. Beyond the broken fence line, the land stretched wide and endless, its silence heavy till the sudden thunder of hooves shattered it. She froze. A wave of wild horses swept across the plain, her manes catching the last rays of gold as they galloped like shadows of another time. Her breath caught in her chest. She had heard whispers that her late husband's ranch still carried secrets, but she never expected this. The town folk had warned her not to stay. They said the land was too hard, the winters too long, and the debts too deep for a widow to manage. But she was stubborn, and perhaps more desperate than proud. This ranch had been her husband's dream, carved out of sweat and sacrifice. She could not walk away from it, even if it meant facing the loneliness of the wide prairie, with nothing but the wind for company. Still, the sight of those horses stirred something in her, a mixture of fear, awe, and curiosity. They were not just strays. They moved as if the land itself belonged to them. In the small village nearby, whispers traveled faster than stagecoaches. Folks said the wild horses carried omens. Some believed they were the restless spirits of old warriors. Others swore they brought fortune to whoever could tame them. She had grown up with such tales, dismissing them as fireside talk. But seeing the herd now under the fading sky made her heart pound with uncertainty. They weren't just animals. They were a mystery tied to this place, a reminder that her late husband may have carried secrets he never shared with her. She turned back toward the household, creaking and full of memories she wasn't sure she wanted to face. The porch boards groaned under her boots, and the sight of the empty chair by the door nearly broke her. Every corner of the ranch reminded her of him, the axe by the woodpile, the saddle slung carelessly across the rail, the rope coiled neat beside the barn. He had left everything behind, except himself. Now it was all hers, whether she wanted it or not. The horses circled back, kicking up dust that drifted toward her like smoke. She thought about shutting the door, retreating to the dim lamplight inside, but something held her there. Perhaps it was the way the lead stallion lifted his head and looked straight toward the porch as though he saw her. His dark eyes met hers across the distance, unblinking, challenging. She shivered. For a moment, she almost thought her husband's spirit lingered in that gaze, watching, guarding, or maybe warning. The village preacher had offered her a place to stay after the burial. "It isn't right for a woman to be alone on such a spread," he had told her kindly, as though she were a child. Others offered the same advice. Sell the land, take what little money it brings, and move into town. But none of them understood. This ranch was more than land and timber. It was the only piece of her husband she had left. If she gave it up, she feared she would lose him completely, and so she remained. Alone, yet not truly alone. For now she knew that the wild horses still roamed here, dozens of them as untamed as the wind. She could almost hear her husband's voice in her mind, warning her of the dangers of approaching them, reminding her that wild things bow to no one. But there was another whisper in her heart, urging her closer, tempting her to discover why he had never spoken of them, why he had left them free, and what it all meant for her future. That night, she sat by the window long after the lamp had burned low, listening to the faint echo of hooves in the distance. The herd did not wander far. She could feel them in the darkness, waiting, just as she was waiting. The land outside seemed alive, restless, filled with secrets yet to be unearthed. Every creak of the house, every whisper of wind through the grass, felt like a reminder that her story on this ranch was only beginning. Sleep would not come easily. Her mind swirled with questions. Why had her husband never told her about the herd? Why did they linger here, so close to the ranch as though tethered to it by something unseen? And what was she supposed to do now, alone with so much land and so many eyes watching from the hills? As the first pale light of dawn crept across the plains, she rose and wrapped a shawl around her shoulders. Outside, the air was sharp with morning chill, and the sky stretched wide with colors of soft pink and amber. The horses were there again, grazing just beyond the fence line as though they had been waiting for her. She tightened her grip on the shawl. The sight was beautiful, but it also stirred unease deep in her bones. It was as if the ranch itself had awakened with her husband's passing, now demanded something of her. The lead stallion lifted his head once more, nostrils flaring, mane tossing in the breeze. Their eyes locked again, and this time she felt it clearly, a challenge. He seemed to be daring her to step beyond the safety of the fence, into a world where nothing was certain and nothing was tame. Her pulse quickened. She had come to claim the ranch, but now it felt as though the land and everything upon it was claiming her instead, and so she stood there, torn between fear and determination, knowing that her next step would shape the path of her life. Behind her, the empty house whispered with memories of what she had lost. Before her, the herd of wild horses waited, their restless energy stirring the air. The prairie held its breath, as if watching to see what she would do. She took one slow step forward, her boots crunching the dry earth, her eyes fixed on the stallion. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to still, the boundary between her old life and what lay ahead narrowing to the width of the fence line. Then the wind rose, carrying dust across the plains and sending the horses into motion once again. They surged forward in a wave of power and freedom, the ground trembling beneath their hooves. She clutched the fence rail, her heart racing, her breath caught somewhere between awe and terror. The stallion's gaze lingered on her, even as he led the herd away, until they vanished into the horizon. Alone once more, she realized the ranch was no longer just hers to claim. It carried a story far older, wilder, and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. And whether she was ready or not, she was now part of it. Would she learn to tame what her husband had left behind? Or would it be the wild horses, the secrets tied to them, that would end up taming her? The question lingered, like the dust still hanging in the air, refusing to settle. The dust had barely settled when she stepped back from the fence, her hands trembling though she tried to steady them. The echo of hooves still rang in her ears, and the image of the stallion's gaze burned in her mind. She had lived on the ranch for years with her husband, yet she never once saw a herd of that size. How long had they been here, roaming just beyond their reach? Why had her husband never spoken of them? Inside the house, the morning light streamed weakly through the thin curtains. She sat at the wooden table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The silence pressed in on her. She had thought grief was the heaviest weight she would ever carry. But now the land itself felt heavy too, alive with secrets. Alive with the sound of galloping hooves that would not leave her memory. The people in town would talk if she told them. They always did. A widow living alone on a wide stretch of prairie was already enough to stir whispers. If word spread about a herd of wild horses on the property, men would come. Some would come with ropes and rifles, hoping to capture and sell them. Others would come out of greed, wanting to claim the land for themselves, saying she was too weak to keep it. She knew this country, and she knew how quickly rumors turned into someone else's opportunity. She rose from the table and began moving through the house, her eyes drifting over the small tokens of a life shared. His coat still hung by the door, stiff with dust and faintly carrying the smell of smoke and leather. His boots rested against the wall. His Bible sat on the shelf with the page marked where he last left off. She touched it gently, then pulled her hand back, unable to linger too long. Every object was a reminder of what she lost, but also a reminder of what he left her to face alone. That afternoon, she saddled the old mare and rode along the fence line. The wind tugged at her hair as she scanned the horizon, searching for a glimpse of the herd. She found tracks in the soft dirt near the creek, a mess of hooves pressed deep. The water muddy from where they had gathered to drink. Her mare grew restless, tossing her head and snorting, as if the scent of the wild horses unsettled her. She stroked the animal's neck to calm her. Though her own heart beat just as fast, the land was wide, stretching farther than she could ride in a day. And each turn of the path revealed the loneliness of her inheritance. She could not help but remember how her husband once walked beside her on these very trails, pointing out fresh shoots of grass or warning her of rattlesnakes that hid near the rocks. Now the land spoke in a different way, through silence, through shadows, through the strange presence of the herd that seemed to haunt her steps. When she returned to the ranch, the evening sky had begun to paint itself in streaks of red and violet. She unsaddled the mare and stood by the barn, staring at the fading light. A sudden rustle in the tall grass made her turn sharply, her pulse leaping. She half expected to see the stallion standing there, watching her again. But there was nothing, only the wind bending the dry stalks. She pressed her lips together and shook her head, telling herself not to let her imagination run away. Yet deep down, she knew it was more than imagination. That night, she dreamed of them. The horses came thundering across the plain, their eyes glowing, their manes streaming like fire. They circled her, and the stallion stopped before her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his breath. In the dream, his eyes were the same dark shade as her husband's, steady and strong, as though he had returned to her through this wild creature. She woke with her heart pounding, the echo of hooves fading into the silence of her small bedroom. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if dreams could be more than dreams in a place like this. Days passed and the herd remained near. She caught glimpses of them at dawn, when the mist still clung to the grass, and again at dusk. Their shapes moving like shadows against the dying light. Sometimes she would hear them in the middle of the night, the rumble of hooves drifting across the plains like distant thunder. They did not seem to fear her, but neither did they draw near. It was as though they were watching her, waiting for her to make a move. She remembered the words of an old trapper she once met years ago. He had told her wild horses were stubborn spirits, bound to the land by something deeper than flesh. They don't just belong to the earth, he had said, his eyes narrowing. Sometimes they belong to the dead who walked it before. She had laughed at the time, dismissing his words as the ramblings of a lonely man. But now those words returned to her, whispering in the back of her mind. When she rode into the village for supplies, she kept her thoughts quiet. She spoke only of flour, salt, and lamp oil, though she could feel the townsfolk watching her with curious eyes. They had their own opinions about her staying on the ranch. Some said she was brave. Others called her foolish. A woman's place, they muttered, was not to wrestle with land and debts. She ignored their talk, but their voices followed her as she loaded her wagon at the edge of town. She met the blacksmith, who paused from his work and wiped the sweat from his brow. He studied her with the kind of look that made her uneasy, half pity and half warning. "Word is the wild ones are moving close again," he said slowly, as though testing her reaction. She forced her face to remain calm, though her chest tightened. "Best you keep your distance. They'll break a man's bones, let alone a woman's." She nodded politely, thanked him, and moved on without a word. She would not give him more than anyone else the satisfaction of knowing what she had seen. Back at the ranch, she found herself listening to the land more closely. Every sound carried weight. The cry of a hawk overhead, the rustle of brush in the wind, the steady whisper of the creek. It was as if the ranch itself was alive, and the herd was only part of the story it was trying to tell her. She began to wonder if her husband had known all along. Perhaps he had chosen not to speak of the herd because some truths were too heavy to share. Perhaps he had hoped she would never need to face them. But now she was alone, and the land would not let her turn away. Each day the herd drew closer, their presence pressing in like a tide. She felt it in her bones, in her breath, even in her dreams. The ranch was no longer just a place of memory. It had become a place of mystery, one that demanded more from her than she ever thought she could give. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sky with streaks of fire, she stood again by the fence, her eyes searching the horizon. And there he was, the stallion, tall and dark, his mane tossing in the wind. This time, he was not alone. Behind him, the rest of the herd gathered, silent and still, their shapes like shadows waiting in the tall grass. Her breath caught in her throat. It was as if they had come for her, as if the moment she had been waiting for had finally arrived. The stallion stamped the ground once, his muscles rippling beneath his hide. Then he lifted his head high, his eyes fixed on her, steady and unyielding. The world seemed to fall silent, the air heavy with meaning. She gripped the fence rail so tightly her knuckles turned white. Was this a warning or an invitation? The question burned through her, unanswered, as the wind rose and the shadows deepened across the plains. The night was coming fast, and with it, the promise of something she could neither predict nor control. And still, The stallion held her gaze. Refusing to let her look away, the stallion's eyes followed her even as the herd shifted behind him, restless in the tall grass. She could feel their energy humming across the ground, pressing against her chest as if daring her to cross the fence. For a moment, she thought of her husband's voice, low, steady, reminding her that wild things were never meant to be tamed. Yet something inside her pulled against that memory, whispering that perhaps the herd had come for a reason. Perhaps her late husband's silence about them was not just caution, but part of a secret he had never found the chance to share. That night, she could not sleep. The lamp burned low on the table, and the wind rattled the loose boards on the porch. Each creak of the house made her turn her head, half expecting the sound of hooves to follow. The loneliness of the prairie pressed heavier than ever. She thought of riding into town the next morning, of telling anyone what she had seen. But the thought of men storming her land with ropes, guns, and greed was worse than the fear she carried. The herd was part of the ranch now, part of her burden. If she spoke of them, she might lose the last piece of her husband's world. The next day, she set out early with her rifle slung across her back. Not for the herd, she told herself that much, but for coyotes or worse that might wander too close. She followed the creek south, where the water thinned and the land grew softer. There, in the muddy banks, she found prints so fresh they still carried the sharp edge of hooves. The herd had been there at dawn. Her mare grew uneasy again, tossing her head, but she urged the animal forward. She needed to see more to understand near the bend of the creek. She found something she had not expected, the remnants of a fire, cold but recent. Charred wood, a ring of stones, and the faint scent of smoke clinging to the air. She dismounted, crouching low as her fingers brushed the ash. Someone had camped here. Someone else knew of the herd. Her breath caught. Had her husband known? Had he met with whoever was here? Or was this stranger drawn to the ranch only after his death? The thought tightened her chest. For the rest of the day, she could not shake the feeling of eyes on her back. She kept glancing over her shoulder, scanning the hills and tree lines. Nothing stirred, yet the silence felt heavier now, carrying a weight of hidden company. When she returned to the ranch, she found the mare sweating and uneasy, ears flicking toward the distant hills. In town a few days later, whispers drifted her way. Men gathered outside the saloon, speaking low but with a sharp edge in their tone. She caught fragments of words horses land, clammed though they never said her name. She felt it hanging unspoken in the air. She pulled her shawl tighter, kept her eyes low, and walked on, but the knot in her stomach grew. Someone had seen the herd. Someone had told one evening, as the sky bruised into night, she heard the distant rumble of hooves. But this time, it was not the steady, rhythmic thunder of the wild herd. It was different, scattered, uneven, mixed with shouts. She hurried to the fence, her heart hammering, and in the fading light, she caught sight of riders. 3 men on horseback, moving fast, driving the herd toward the open plain. The stallion reared, fighting against their advance, the rest of the herd scattering in panic. She gripped the rail, fury and fear battling within her. How dare they? This was her land, her husband's land. The herd did not belong to them. She almost ran for her rifle, but her legs would not move. All she could do was watch as dust rose into the sky, the shouts of men echoing across the fields. At last, the herd broke free, surging past the riders and scattering into the darkness. The stallion lingered, standing tall, his silhouette defiant, against the horizon. The men cursed, reined in their horses, and rode off in the opposite direction. When silence returned, she realized her hands were shaking so badly she could barely unclench them from the fence rail. The herd had escaped, but only for now. Men would return. They would not stop until they claimed what they thought was theirs. And she knew then that her fight was no longer just with grief or loneliness. She would have to defend the ranch not just for herself, but for the herd her husband had left unspoken. The days that followed were uneasy. The stallion began appearing closer to the house, sometimes at dawn, sometimes just before nightfall. He would stand at a distance, watching, unflinching. It was as if he knew she was caught in the same struggle he faced, the fight to hold on to something that others sought to take. She began to feel a strange kinship with him, a bond she could not explain. She started to notice other signs around the ranch. A fence post loosened. Tracks that were not her own, near the barn. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. Someone was testing her boundaries, waiting for her to slip, to give up. Yet she would not. Each night she checked the locks twice, laid her rifle by the door, and sat listening for the sounds that did not belong. The townsfolk became part of the unease as well. A widow's business was always the business of others. Some women brought baskets of bread and soft words, but behind their eyes she could see their doubt. Men tipped their hats politely, but their offers to help carried too much eagerness. Help often meant something taken in return. She kept her answers short and her distance firm. Still, she could not ignore the question that gnawed at her. Why had her husband kept the herd's secret? Had he struck some agreement with someone? Had he protected them? Or had he feared what others might do if they knew? She searched his old papers in the desk, the boxes stacked in the barn, even the pages of his Bible for some note, some clue. But all she found were debts unpaid and lists of supplies. Nothing that explained the shadow now cast over her days. The mystery deepened when she returned to the creek one morning and found fresh tracks boot prints. Larger than her own, pressed into the mud near the water. Whoever had camped there before was back. And judging by the direction of the tracks, they had followed the herd. She crouched low, her hand brushing the earth, her chest tight with the knowledge that someone else was chasing what was now hers to guard. That night she dreamed again. This time, the stallion stood closer than ever, his breath warm on her cheek, his eyes filled with something she could not name. Behind him, the herd waited, silent as stone, and in the dream she felt a hand on her shoulder, not the stallion's, not her own. Her husband's hand. She woke with tears on her face, her heart aching with both longing and fear. She rose before dawn, unable to rest, and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp with cold, and the stars still hung heavy in the sky. From the hills came the sound she had dreaded and yet expected, the low rumble of riders. Not the herd men. They were coming closer, their voices faint but growing. She gripped the post of the porch, her breath clouding in the air. She was not ready. She did not know what she would do. But the fight was no longer far away. It was at her doorstep, creeping nearer with every hoofbeat, and somewhere in the darkness, the stallion lifted his head, waiting for her choice. The sound of riders on the ridge grew louder, and she pressed her back against the porch post, listening as the hooves struck the frozen ground in a steady rhythm. The night air carried their voices, rough and careless, men who thought themselves alone in the dark. She held her breath, straining to hear, but only caught fragments, the words, horses, and claim repeating like warnings. She tightened her grip on the rifle in her hands. Though her palms were slick with sweat, the stallion's silhouette flickered on the horizon, his form cutting against the last glimmer of starlight. He stood still, unmoving, as though he too was watching the riders descend. She felt as if he and the herd were tied to her fate, caught in the same snare that now closed around the ranch. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. She thought of running into town, seeking help, but the thought vanished as quickly as it came. The men who were after the herd were not strangers. They were likely the same townsfolk who tipped their hats too politely, whose voices carried whispers the moment she turned away. If she went to them now, she would return with a crowd hungry for what lay on her land. No, she realized with a hard swallow. This fight was hers alone. The riders reached the lower field just as dawn broke. Streaks of pale light spilling across the prairie. She crept from the porch into the shadow of the barn, her breath shallow, her steps careful against the frosted ground. From there she could see them clearly. 3 men, broad-shouldered, rough in manner, their faces worn from sun and wind. They scanned the land with greedy eyes, speaking low but sharp. She couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough to know their intent. They meant to drive the herd south, away from her claim, and sell what they caught. Her heart pounded with a fear that was tangled with anger. These men weren't just after horses. They were after control. The ranch was already a question on every tongue in town. A widow, living alone, holding land too large for one person, was bait for vultures. And now, with the herd roaming, they had the excuse they needed. She stayed hidden, watching as the men rode the fields, circling wide as though testing how near the herd might be. She thought of firing a shot into the air, of letting them know she was watching, but fear held her finger still. A warning shot would not scare them off. Fit would invite them closer. The day dragged slow and uneasy. The men kept their distance, but their presence was a shadow that stretched long across the ranch. She tried to work, mending a fence post and gathering wood, but every task was broken by the need to glance over her shoulder. Even the mare was unsettled, pacing the corral and snorting at every shift of the wind. By evening, she spotted the herd again, farther out but still near. The stallion stood tall, leading them along the ridge as if daring the men to follow. For a moment, she felt a strange comfort in his defiance. But comfort turned quickly to dread. If the men chose to strike tonight, she had only herself and her rifle to stand between them and everything she was trying to protect. That night, sleep would not come. She sat by the window, the lamplight dim, the rifle resting across her knees. Outside, the prairie stretched endless and dark, broken only by the pale wash of moonlight. Every sound seemed sharper, the rustle of grass, the distant cry of a coyote, the groan of wood as the house settled. And then, just past midnight, came the sound she dreaded, hooves, moving fast. Too many to be her herd. She blew out the lamp and slipped to the door, her bare feet silent on the worn boards. Through the crack of the doorframe, she saw them riders moving along the fence line, their lanterns swinging, their shadows long across the grass. She gripped the rifle so tightly her hands ached. They had come under cover of darkness, bold and certain. Her stomach turned with fear. But beneath it burned a spark of something else, a rising fire she did not recognize in herself until now. She could not let them take what her husband had left her. She could not let them scatter the herd and tear away the last piece of him she still carried. She stepped out onto the porch, her figure swallowed in shadow. The nearest rider paused, his lantern swinging toward her. His horse shifted, snorting as though it sensed her tension. "Evenin', ma'am," the man called, his tones slick with false courtesy. "Mighty fine night to ride, wouldn't you say?" Her voice caught in her throat, but she forced the words out, steady as she could manage. "This is private land. You've no business here." The man laughed low, glancing at the others. "Private? A spread this wide, held by one woman alone? Ain't much private about it anymore." Her finger brushed the trigger, though she held her aim low. "Leave," she said firmly. "Now." For a moment, the riders hesitated, exchanging looks. Then the leader tipped his hat, grinning. "We'll be back, ma'am. Best you think hard on whether you can keep all this for yourself. Horses don't belong to widows. They belong to men who know how to handle them." With that, they turned their horses and rode off into the night, their laughter drifting behind them like a curse. She stood frozen until the sound of hooves faded, her chest heaving, her knees weak. Only when silence returned did she lower the rifle, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. But even as fear flooded her, another truth took root. They would return, and next time they would not stop at words. In the days that followed, she moved like a shadow through her own home, alert to every sound. The herd appeared less often, pushed farther into the hills by the men who now prowled the land. Each time she caught sight of them, her heart ached. The stallion still held his ground, defiant and strong. But she could feel the pressure building, the walls closing in around them both. She began preparing in quiet ways. She stacked wood higher near the house, mended the fences with stronger rails, and kept the rifle loaded at all times. At night, she set the lanterns low and watched the horizon. Waiting for the next time the riders came, the tension grew unbearable. Even the air felt charged, heavy with the weight of what was coming. The villagers whispered louder each time she passed through town. Some offered pity, others carried greed in their eyes, but all of them knew something was happening out on the ranch. She could see it in the way they looked at her, as though she were a candle about to burn out. One evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, she stood by the fence once more. The stallion appeared on the ridge, his mane whipping in the wind, the herd clustered behind him. His eyes met hers across the distance, and she felt the strange connection again, stronger now than ever. It was as if he knew what she faced, as if he too braced for the storm that was about to break. The ground trembled faintly, the sound of hooves carrying from the hills, not the steady rhythm of the herd, but the jarring, uneven beat of men riding fast. She froze, every muscle tense. They were coming again, and this time she knew. There would be no turning back. The stallion reared, his cry piercing the air, echoing like a battle call across the prairie. The herd shifted restlessly, their shapes dark against the fading light. She clutched the rifle, her breath ragged, her heart thundering with the same wild rhythm that shook the ground. The riders crested the hill, their lanterns swinging, their voices harsh in the night air. She stood rooted at the fence, torn between fear and fury, knowing the moment she had dreaded and awaited had finally arrived. The ranch, the herd. Her husband's memory, everything balanced on the edge of what came next. The air grew thick with dust, the earth shaking with the approach of men and horses alike. The stallion's gaze locked on hers, unyielding, fierce, as if willing her to stand her ground. And in that breathless, unbearable moment, she knew the climax was upon her, but the outcome, whether loss, triumph, or ruin, remained hidden in the shadows of what was yet to unfold. The riders thundered down the hill, their lanterns flaring against the dark, their shouts carrying sharp through the night. She pressed her back to the fence rail, her rifle steady in her hands, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The stallion reared on the ridge, his cry slicing through the air, a sound so fierce it sent a shiver down her spine. The herd surged restlessly behind him, hooves striking the ground in rhythm with the riders bearing down. It felt like two worlds colliding, the wild and the greedy, the free and the claimed. When the first rider broke ahead of the others, his horse churning up dust, she lifted the rifle and fired. The shot cracked across the land, echoing into silence. She hadn't aimed to kill, her bullet split the dirt a few feet from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly throwing its rider, who cursed and pulled back. The other men slowed, surprised by her boldness. She stepped forward into the lantern light, her face pale, but her stance steady. "This ranch is mine," she called out, her voice stronger than she expected. "The herd is mine to guard. You'll not take them." The men exchanged looks, their horses restless under them. For a moment it seemed they might charge anyway. But the stallion cried out again, and the herd surged forward, hooves pounding like thunder rolling over the earth. The riders' horses shied, panicked by the wild energy, and the men struggled to control them. In the chaos, dust rose thick, the herd sweeping across the field like a storm. One of the men shouted above the din, "They'll trample us all if we stay." Another cursed, yanking his reins, pulling his mount back. One by one, they retreated, swallowed by the dust and darkness, their lanterns flickering like dying stars until they vanished over the ridge. When silence finally returned, her knees weakened and she sagged against the fence. The herd circled wide, their power unbroken, the stallion standing tall at their lead. His eyes met hers one last time across the field, steady, almost solemn, as though he understood what had just passed between them. Then, with a toss of his mane, he turned, guiding the herd into the hills, their thunder fading into the distance until only silence remained. She stood there long after, the rifle hanging loosely at her side, the cold air stinging her face. Relief washed through her, but it was tangled with something deeper, something that felt like understanding. The herd did not belong to her in the way men thought of ownership. They belonged to the land, to the wild, to the memory of all who had lived and worked here before her. Yet in guarding them, in standing her ground, she had claimed something for herself too, a strength she never knew she carried. When dawn came, the prairie stretched wide and golden once more. As if the night's storm had been a dream, she moved through the house slowly, her hand brushing the worn wood of the table, the coat still hanging by the door, the saddle by the rail. They no longer felt like relics of what she lost, but reminders of what she had chosen to keep alive. Her husband had built this ranch with his hands, his sweat, and his silence. Perhaps he had known the herd would remain untamed and free. Perhaps that was why he never spoke of them, because some things were meant to be felt, not explained. In the days that followed, word spread in town that the herd had been seen running wild again, stronger than ever. The riders who had tried to claim them said little, their pride too wounded to admit a widow had stood them down. Whispers shifted from pity to grudging respect, though some still carried envy in their eyes. She paid no mind. She had no need for their approval. The ranch was quiet again, and that was enough. She spent her mornings riding the fence line, the mare's ears flicking nervously whenever the wind carried the scent of the herd. Sometimes, at the edge of the horizon, she caught sight of the stallion leading them, dark against the sunlit grass. He never came close again, but his presence was steady, like a shadow that belonged to the land itself. Each glimpse reminded her that she was not alone. Slowly, the weight of grief began to shift. It did not leave her, it never could, but it grew lighter as she worked the land, mended what was broken, and found purpose in each day. The ranch was not just a memory of her husband anymore. It had become her own story, tied to the wildness that roamed its fields. She came to see the herd as a gift, not a burden, living symbol of resilience, of freedom, of the untamed spirit that had carried her this far. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, she sat on the porch with a mug of coffee warm in her hands. The air was still painted with gold, the prairie stretching endless before her. In the distance, she heard the faintest echo of hooves carried on the wind. It made her smile, soft and sure. The herd was out there alive and free, and so was she. The ranch no longer felt like a lonely place. It felt alive, restless, demanding, but alive. Every creak of the barn, every cry of a hawk, every whisper of wind through the grass reminded her that she was part of something larger, something unbroken. She thought of the words often said in town that widows could not hold land, that wild horses belonged to men. She knew now how wrong they were. Strength did not always come with numbers or with force. Sometimes it came with standing alone, holding on when the world tried to take everything away. Seasons turned, and the ranch grew into its own rhythm. The winters were still harsh, the debts still heavy, but she bore them with new resolve. She traded fairly in town, kept her chin high when whispers followed her, and rode her land each day with quiet pride. The herd remained near, their presence constant, their movements like a heartbeat that matched her own. In time, she came to see that the wild horses were not just her husband's secret, they were his legacy. He had left her more than land and memory. He had left her the gift of a bond that could not be broken, a reminder that freedom and strength often came with great cost, but were always worth the fight. On a clear morning, at the edge of spring, she stood by the fence again, watching as the herd moved across the plain. The stallion paused, his head lifted high, his mane shining in the rising sun. For a moment, the distance between them vanished. She felt her husband's presence in the stillness, in the earth beneath her boots, in the sky stretched wide above. Her eyes stung, but she did not cry. Instead, she smiled. The herd thundered on, their hooves carrying them beyond sight, leaving the land quiet once more. She turned back toward the house, her heart steady, her steps firm. The ranch was hers now, not because she claimed it on paper, but because she had fought for it, lived for it, and found herself within it. The wild horses would always roam here, their spirit woven into the fields and hills, and as long as they did, she would never be truly alone. Her story, like theirs, was one of survival, of strength, and of freedom unbroken. And with that truth, she knew the ranch would endure untamed, unclaimed by any but those who understood it in the end. It was not the loss that defined her, but the life she chose to keep living, in step with the wild rhythm of the land.